There was a moment when Elias Vorn looked down at his own hands and did not recognize them. Not because something was wrong with his hands, because something was wrong with everything he had ever believed about the person those hands belonged to. He was sitting at his desk at 2 in the morning, surrounded by stacks of notebooks he had filled over the previous 3 months. Notebooks covered in drawings he could not explain, symbols he had never studied, faces of people he had never met. He was not dreaming, he was completely awake. And the most terrifying part was not what was in those notebooks. The most terrifying part was that somewhere deep inside, it all made perfect sense. I want to tell you about Elias because I think what happened to him happens to more people than anyone is willing to admit. It just usually happens quietly, behind closed doors, in the middle of the night, and most people spend the rest of their lives pretending it never did. Elias did not pretend. That decision cost him almost everything, and it gave him something that cannot be named in any language that respectable people use at dinner parties. The room where he sat that night smelled like cold coffee and old paper. The lamp on his desk threw a narrow yellow circle of light, and everything outside that circle was dark. He could hear the building settling around him, those low, creaking sounds old structures make when the temperature drops. His breath was slow, his hands were still. And on the desk in front of him was a drawing he had made earlier that evening without fully realizing he was making it. A figure standing at the edge of something vast, arms open, facing away. Around the figure, in careful concentric rings, symbols that looked like no alphabet he had ever studied professionally, but that he somehow knew how to read. He closed the notebook. He pressed his palm flat against the cover, and he asked himself, out loud, in that silent room, the question that would change the entire direction of his life. He said quietly, to no one, "What is happening to me?" Here is what you need to understand about who Elias was before that night. He was not a fragile man. He was not someone given to fantasy or mystical thinking, or any of the things that word tends to invite as company. He was a neuroscientist, a serious one. The kind of man who built his entire identity on the premise that if you cannot measure something, it does not deserve your full attention. He had spent 15 years studying the brain with the dedication of someone who genuinely believed that consciousness was a product of biology and nothing more. His office at the university was lined with published papers that bore his name. His students called him precise. His colleagues called him rigorous. His ex-wife, in a moment of rare honesty during their last conversation before the divorce, called him unreachable. He had filed that observation away in the same mental drawer where he kept all feedback that did not fit his current model of himself. Sealed, labeled, ignored. And yet, even at the height of all that clarity, there were cracks. Small ones, easy to explain away. A recurring sensation during certain experiments that the data was pointing somewhere the methodology was not designed to follow. A heaviness in his chest during lectures on the limits of consciousness, as if some part of him knew he was performing certainty rather than feeling it. Dreams that arrived with unusual weight. Not nightmares exactly. More like messages written in a language he had never formally learned, but that his body seemed to understand before his mind caught up. He dismissed them, every single time, because dismissing them was the only move available to the version of himself he had worked so hard to construct. The version that began to dissolve on the night he sat alone with those notebooks and realized that the drawings inside them were not the product of stress or overwork. They were something else entirely, something that had been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for him to finally stop being too busy to listen. That patience, it turned out, had a name, and Elias was about to meet it. Friends, if this kind of story moves something in you, please subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this work reach people who need it. There is something specific about the way success feels when it is built entirely on the outside of a person. It has a particular texture, smooth on the surface, hollow underneath. Like a beautifully constructed wall with nothing behind it but cold air. Elias knew that texture intimately, even if he would not have described it in those terms at the time. At the time, he would have described his life as exactly what it appeared to be. Accomplished. Structured. evidence-based. He was 39 when the visions started, but the story of why they started begins years earlier, in a seminar room on the fourth floor of a research institute in a northern city where the winters were long and the light was thin, and the academic culture rewarded precision above almost everything else. Elias was presenting new findings on neural correlates of self-referential thought. The room was full. His slides were immaculate. His delivery was controlled and confident. And halfway through the presentation, a young student in the third row raised her hand and asked a question that should have been simple. She asked, "But who is doing the observing?" She meant it technically. Elias answered it technically. But something in the question stayed with him like a splinter too small to find, but too persistent to ignore. Who is doing the observing? He turned the question over in his mind on the walk home that evening, in the gray, late-afternoon light, past bare trees and wet pavement, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not have a satisfying answer. He did not tell anyone about that feeling. That was the habit of a lifetime. Elias processed difficulty alone, quietly, and then presented the world with only the conclusions, never the process, never the uncertainty. His apartment was evidence of this, ordered, minimal, every object in its correct place, the kind of space that communicates control, the kind of space that communicates, "I have handled this." A single plant on the kitchen windowsill, still alive mostly through obligation rather than care, books arranged by subject, a desk clear of everything except what was currently in use. But inside that ordered space, something was accumulating. The dreams were becoming more specific. The splinter of that student's question was working its way deeper. And a growing sense that the map he had been using to navigate his own inner life was, perhaps, not a map of the actual territory at all, but rather a map of the territory he had decided, very early on, was the only one worth exploring. The collapse, when it came, would not arrive as a dramatic event. It would arrive as a quiet and total withdrawal of belief. The scaffolding would not fall. It would simply stop holding. And Elias, standing inside the structure of a life built entirely on measurable certainty, would one morning wake up and realize that the ground beneath everything he had built was not ground at all. It was a door, and it had been open the entire time. The first vision did not arrive gently. It arrived like a fist through glass. Elias was sitting in his kitchen one morning, coffee in hand, staring at nothing in particular through the window, when the entire room disappeared. Not darkness, not sleep. The kitchen was still there, the table, the plant on the windowsill, the gray morning light coming through the glass. But overlaid on top of all of it, as vivid and solid as anything physically present, was a burning library. Shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, every one of them on fire, books dissolving into ash before they could fall. No smoke, no heat, no sound at all. Just the silent, total consumption of everything written, everything recorded, everything known. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then it was gone. Elias set his coffee down very carefully, as if sudden movement might bring it back. His hand was shaking. He did not write it in his professional notes. He wrote it in a separate notebook, a plain one with a dark cover that he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk at home, the drawer that required a little force to open. He described it with the same clinical precision he applied to everything: time of occurrence, duration, visual content, emotional residue. That last category gave him trouble, because the emotional residue was not fear, which would have been straightforward to categorize. It was recognition.
as if some part of him had seen that burning library before and was not surprised to see it again. Over the following weeks, more arrived. They came without schedule, without warning, without apparent trigger. A faceless crowd walking slowly into a dense white fog, each figure carrying something too small to identify, all of them moving with the calm certainty of people who know exactly where they are going and have made their peace with it. A narrow stone corridor that descended at a slight angle into absolute darkness, with the sound of water somewhere far below. And the one that unsettled him most deeply. A child standing at the edge of a vast open space, back-turned, laughing. Not in distress, laughing freely, completely, the way children laugh when they have discovered something that adults have long since forgotten how to find.
Elias watched that child every time the vision came and felt something move in his chest that he had no professional language for. He cross-referenced everything. He read about hypnagogic imagery, about stress-induced perceptual distortions, about the documented relationship between intellectual overload and involuntary visualization. He built a plausible explanatory framework. It was the kind of framework that looks solid until you press on it, and then it gives way entirely. Because the visions were not random, they were sequential. They were building toward something. And whatever that something was, it was not going to wait for him to find a comfortable explanation before it arrived. The notebook in the bottom drawer was filling up faster than he expected, and the question he had asked himself out loud in that dim room, the one that changed everything, was beginning to answer itself in ways he had not anticipated and could not control. What followed that realization was not a gentle awakening. It was the specific and very uncomfortable experience of a man watching his most fundamental assumptions begin to loosen their grip one by one. Elias had spent years building a version of himself that the world around him could verify. Published research, institutional affiliation, peer recognition. These were not just career achievements, they were load-bearing walls. And when he submitted the paper, the one that would end everything as he knew it, he understood on some level that he was not publishing research, he was detonating something. The paper was precise, careful, and completely unacceptable to the world he had built his life inside. In it, Elias argued that consciousness could not be fully contained within any model that treated the individual mind as a closed system. That there existed within the human psyche a layer of experience that operated independently of personal memory, personal history, and personal biology. That this layer was not metaphysical speculation, but a measurable, documentable, and consistently recurring feature of human inner life that mainstream neuroscience had been systematically ignoring because it did not fit the existing architecture of acceptable inquiry. He submitted it on a Tuesday morning, in the thin winter light, with the feeling of a man who has just stepped off a ledge and is waiting to find out whether the ground is closer than expected. He did not wait long. Within 2 weeks, the response came. Not the measured collegial disagreement he had half expected, something colder. His work was described as a departure from scientific standards. The journal that had published his last 4 papers declined to review this one. His department head called him into a meeting and spoke to him in the careful, quiet tone people use when they are saying something they want to be able to deny having said. And Professor Hadrian Voss, the man who had supervised Elias's doctoral research, the man whose recommendation had opened every significant door in his career, released a brief public statement expressing his concern about the direction of Elias's recent thinking. Elias read that statement standing in his office, late in the afternoon, the light outside already fading. The room smelled like printer paper and the particular staleness of a space that had been occupied too long without being properly aired. He read the statement twice, then he folded it in half, placed it in the bottom of the wastebasket under his desk, and sat for a long time in the growing dark without turning on a light. He thought about the burning library from his vision, all that knowledge dissolving silently into ash. At the time, he had cataloged it as disturbing. Sitting in that darkening office, he began to wonder whether he had misread it entirely. Whether what he had seen was not a warning, whether it was, in fact, a door. Elias lost his position on a Friday. By the following Monday, he had stopped checking his email, not because he was avoiding the fallout, though there was plenty of it, but because something far more demanding had taken over the entire available space of his attention. The visions had changed. After the paper, after Voss, after the meeting with the department head and the slow withdrawal of every professional anchor he had spent 15 years securing, the imagery that had been arriving in quiet flashes began arriving in floods. He would sit down to eat, and the room would shift. He would lie down to sleep and find himself standing somewhere else entirely, somewhere that had no address in the physical world, but felt more solid than anything he could touch with his hands. He was not sleeping poorly. He was not eating poorly. He was not, by any clinical definition he had spent his career applying to other people, unwell. He was, instead, awake in a way he had never been before, and that was the thing that frightened him most. Not that something was wrong, but that something was becoming very, very right, and he had no framework left to process it. He made a decision. He did not make it dramatically. He made it the way exhausted people make the most important decisions of their lives. Quietly, without ceremony, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. He decided to stop resisting. He had spent months treating the visions as a problem to be solved, a signal to be decoded, an anomaly to be filed and explained away. He had applied every professional tool he owned to the task of making them fit inside a box he could carry comfortably. None of it had worked. So he put down the tools, all of them, and he simply decided to go toward whatever was calling him, the same way you walk toward a sound in a dark house, not because you are unafraid, but because standing still has stopped being an option. He cleared the second bedroom of his apartment. It had been used for storage, boxes of old research materials, a broken chair, a set of shelves that had never been assembled. He carried everything out, cleaned the floor, and left the room completely empty except for a single cushion in the center and a low table beside it with a notebook and a pen. No technology, no clock. The window faced a courtyard where a single tree stood, and in the mornings the light came through in a way that made the empty room feel less like absence and more like preparation. He began sitting there every day, at first for an hour, then for 2, then for as long as it took for something to arrive. He sat with his eyes open. He did not try to meditate in any formal sense. He did not follow a technique or a tradition. He simply sat and made himself available, the way you leave a door open for someone you had been waiting for without knowing their name. The images that came during those sessions were different from the involuntary flashes of the previous months. Those had the texture of something breaking through a barrier. These had the texture of something being invited in. And what arrived in that empty room, in that thin morning light, with the smell of old wood and cool air and the occasional sound of the tree moving outside the window, was not chaos. It was extraordinarily, almost unbearably, specific. The first figure arrived on the 5th morning. Elias had been sitting for perhaps 40 minutes when the quality of the air in the room changed. Not temperature, not light. Something more difficult to name, a density, a sense of presence, the way a room feels different when someone walks into it, even before you turn to look. He did not turn. He kept his eyes on the middle distance and waited. And at the edge of his vision, not outside his body but not quite inside it either, a figure assembled itself from the quality of the silence. Not dramatically. Not with any of the visual drama of the involuntary visions. Slowly, the way a shape emerges from fog when you have been staring at it long enough. It was a man, old but not frail. Lean in the way that people who have walked long distances are lean. He was wearing something that Elias could not fully describe afterwards, a long coat perhaps, or a robe, the boundary between the two unclear. His face was deeply lined and his eyes were extraordinary, not in color or size, but in the way they held attention, the way the eyes of very few real people ever do, as if they were looking at you and also at something directly behind you, simultaneously, without effort. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood there, at the edge of the room, and looked at Elias with the patient expression of someone who has been waiting and is entirely unsurprised to have finally arrived. Elias did not panic. He noticed that he did not panic and filed it away as significant. His breathing stayed even. His hands stayed still on his knees. And after a silence that felt both very short and very long, he said, out loud, to this figure that had no physical presence and yet filled the room more completely than any physical person ever had. He said simply, "Who are you?" The figure looked at him for a moment. And then, with the measured, unhurried calm of someone answering a question they have been asked many times before, it said, "The better question is, who have you been pretending to be?" Elias picked up the notebook from the low table beside him. His hand was steady. He wrote down every word. And something in the room, in the air, in the particular texture of that morning light, shifted in a way that told him, with absolute clarity, that this was only the beginning. Casimir was not the only one waiting in the silence. That was the thing Elias had not anticipated. He had imagined, in the way that rational people imagine things they have no real framework for, that the inner world would have a kind of orderly hierarchy, one guide, one source, a clean single frequency he could tune into and learn from. What he found instead was a population, a whole interior world inhabited by figures as distinct and consistent as people he had known in physical life, each one arriving with their own weight, their own agenda, their own particular quality of presence. And not all of them were comfortable to be around. The blind cartographer came on the 9th morning. Elias was sitting in his usual position, notebook open on the low table beside him, when the figure appeared at the far edge of his inner vision. A man of indeterminate age, slight, with long fingers and a careful way of moving, as if every step was being measured and recorded. His eyes were closed, not shut in pain or sleep, but closed in the permanent way of someone who had long since stopped needing physical sight to navigate. He carried nothing visible, and yet his hands moved constantly, tracing shapes in the air in front of him, roads and corridors and intersections that Elias could not see but somehow felt the shape of. The cartographer never spoke in words. He communicated in the way that very old knowledge communicates, not through language, but through the sudden understanding that drops into you fully formed, the way you sometimes wake up knowing the answer to something you fell asleep not knowing. What he brought Elias that morning was a map of the interior, not symbolic, not metaphorical, an actual felt sense of the structure of the inner world, its levels, its territories, its areas of density, and its areas of extraordinary openness. Elias filled 6 pages in the notebook before the figure faded. His hand was cramped. He had not noticed. The woman made of smoke arrived 3 days later. She was the most unsettling of all the figures, not because she was threatening, but because she offered nothing solid. She had a face, but it changed depending on the angle. She had a voice, but it asked rather than answered, always questions, never conclusions. And the questions had the specific quality of the kind that opened something in you rather than closing it. She asked Elias things like, "What are you still carrying that was never yours to carry?" And, "What would you do with your life if you were not trying to prove something to someone who is no longer watching?" He did not answer out loud. He wrote the questions down and sat with them in the way you sit with something that has too much weight to be moved quickly. Some of them he is still sitting with now. The child came last. The same child from his early visions, the one standing at the edge of the vast open space, laughing. But in the sessions, the child turned around, and Elias saw his own face, younger than any photograph he owned, younger than any memory he could consciously access, before any of it, before the career and the precision and the carefully managed identity. The child looked at him with complete recognition and absolute ease, and said nothing at all. Just looked. And Elias felt something shift in the center of his chest, something that had been held very tight for a very long time, loosening its grip by 1 degree. Just 1. But it was enough to feel. Casimir returned the following morning. He stood in his usual position and regarded Elias with the same unhurried attention as always. And Elias, who by now had learned to meet him without the residual nervousness of the early sessions, asked him directly about the other figures. About the cartographer and the smoke woman and the child. He asked whether they were aspects of his own psyche or something else entirely. Casimir looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "That question is the wrong size for what you are actually asking. What you are asking is whether the things happening inside you are real. And the answer is that reality is not a fixed address. It is a range. You have spent your entire career measuring one end of that range. You are now learning that the other end exists." Elias wrote it down. He wrote everything down. Every session, every figure, every question, every response, every felt sense that arrived too complete and too specific to have been assembled by his conscious mind alone. The notebooks were accumulating on the shelf above the low table, a row of dark spines, each one dated on the cover. He had filled 9 of them in less than 2 months, and he had begun to notice something that he did not yet have language for, but that was becoming impossible to ignore. The ideas arriving through these sessions, the frameworks and insights and structural understandings of the inner world that Casimir and the other figures were delivering, were not ideas he recognized from his own reading. He had read widely, deeply, obsessively. He knew his field and its adjacent territories intimately. And yet session after session, what arrived was genuinely new to him. Not variations on existing ideas, not recombinations of what he already knew. Something else. Something that came from a direction he had no name for, and that landed with a weight and a clarity that his own thinking, however rigorous, had never quite managed. He began to test it. Systematically, the way he tested everything. He would take a concept delivered in a session and spend days tracing it through every philosophical and scientific tradition he could access. Hermetic texts, Vedic philosophy, Sufi mysticism, early phenomenological psychology, contemplative neuroscience. And every time, without a single exception, what Casimir had said turned out to be independently confirmed by some tradition somewhere, often multiple traditions simultaneously. Traditions that had arrived at the same insight from completely different starting points across completely different centuries. The convergence was not coincidental. It was structural. It was as if there existed a layer of understanding beneath all the separate systems of human knowledge, a bedrock that the different traditions had each found a different path to, and that Casimir was somehow drawing from directly, without the paths. Elias sat with that realization for a long time. And then he opened a fresh notebook and wrote at the top of the first page, in the careful handwriting he had used for 15 years of research. He wrote, "The source is not the library. The library is just the record of people who found the source before me." Then he paused. And underneath it, in smaller letters, he wrote, "I have found it." And then, almost immediately, Casimir appeared at the edge of his vision, without being summoned, without a session having started, and said, quietly and with absolute precision, "Not yet, but you are closer than you think. And what comes next will require something from you that precision alone cannot provide." Casimir stopped coming. Not gradually, not with any warning or farewell. One morning Elias sat down in the empty room, settled into his usual position, opened the notebook, and waited. Nothing arrived. The room was just a room. The light through the window was just light. The silence was just silence, flat and empty in a way it had not been for months, like a frequency that had been broadcasting continuously and had suddenly gone off the air. He waited for 2 hours, then 3. Then he closed the notebook and sat with his hands in his lap and felt something he had not expected to feel. Not relief, not peace, a specific and very clean variety of dread. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. For 11 days, nothing. The other figures were also gone. The cartographer, the smoke woman, the child, all of them absent with the same totality as Casimir. The room that had felt like the most alive space in his life now felt like a waiting room in a building whose purpose he no longer understood. He kept showing up. That was all he could do. He kept showing up and sitting in the silence and waiting and writing nothing because there was nothing to write. And then, on the 12th morning, something came. But it was not Casimir. It was not any of the figures he recognized. It was something else entirely. And from the moment it arrived, Elias understood what Casimir had meant when he said that what comes next will require something that precision alone cannot provide. Because what arrived in that room on the 12th morning was not wisdom. It was not guidance. It was not a figure with extraordinary eyes offering carefully measured truths. What arrived was a mirror. And the mirror showed him everything he had been avoiding looking at directly for the entirety of his adult life. It did not shout. It did not accuse. It simply showed, the way a mirror does, with complete and indifferent accuracy. And what Elias saw in it was not a monster. That would have been easier. What he saw was something far more difficult to dismiss. He saw the precise and documented record of every moment he had chosen his own comfort over someone else's truth. Every student whose genuine question he had redirected because it threatened the architecture of his preferred conclusions. Every colleague whose alternative thinking he had dismissed, not because it was wrong, but because engaging with it seriously would have required him to revise something he was not willing to revise. His ex-wife's voice, saying unreachable, and the exact moment he had decided that was her limitation rather than his. All of it present in the mirror simultaneously, not as accusation, but as inventory. Here is what you have done. Here is what it cost. Here is the ledger, complete and balanced to the last entry. Elias sat with that mirror for a very long time. He did not write in the notebook. He did not try to analyze or categorize what he was seeing. He simply looked. And what surprised him, what he had not expected and could not have prepared for, was that the looking did not feel like punishment. It felt, underneath the discomfort and the shame and the particular cold clarity of being fully seen, it felt like the first completely honest conversation he had ever had. With himself, about himself, without any of the management or framing or careful presentation he had applied to every other version of self-examination in his life. Just the truth, laid flat on the table, asking for nothing except to be acknowledged. He acknowledged it. Every item. He sat there in the thin morning light with the smell of old wood around him and the sound of the tree outside the window, and he went through the entire ledger without looking away once. It took the better part of a day. When it was over, he was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with his body. He picked up the notebook. He wrote one sentence. He wrote, "I have been a precise man in an imprecise relationship with myself." Then he closed the notebook and went to bed at 7 in the evening and slept for 11 hours without a single dream. Elias woke up the next morning and did not recognize his own apartment. Not in a frightening way, in the way that familiar places sometimes look strange when you are seeing them from a genuinely new position inside yourself. The ordered shelves, the clear desk, the single plant on the kitchen windowsill, all of it was still there, all of it unchanged. But the story he had always told himself about what it meant, the story of the controlled man who had handled everything, that story had simply stopped running. Like a projector that had been playing the same film for so long that no one noticed it was still on until the moment it went dark. The room was still there. The film was gone. And in the silence left behind, something Elias had no name for yet was beginning to breathe. He did not go to the empty room that morning. Instead, he walked. He left the apartment without a destination and walked through the city for hours, through streets he rarely used, past buildings he had passed hundreds of times without seeing. The city smelled like wet stone and coffee and cold air and the particular exhaust of morning traffic. He walked until his feet ached, and then he kept walking. Not to get somewhere, to be in motion while something in him stood perfectly still for the first time. Because that is what the mirror had done. It had not broken him. It had stopped him. And in being stopped, in having nowhere left to run toward and no version of himself left to perform, something underneath all the performance had taken its first full breath. He found himself standing on a bridge over a wide river, looking at the water. The surface was moving, but the depths were still. He stood there for a long time. He was not thinking about Casimir, or the notebooks, or the dismantled career, or the ledger the mirror had shown him. He was thinking about the child, the one who had turned around in the sessions and shown him his own face from before all of it. He was thinking that the child had never looked lost. The child had looked entirely at home in the vast open space at the edge of which it stood. And Elias, standing on the bridge above the still deep water, understood for the first time that the vast open space was not out there somewhere. It was in here. It had always been in here, and the collapse of everything outside him had not been a catastrophe. It had been an eviction. His old self had been evicted from the only address it had ever known. And now, standing above the river with aching feet and nothing left to prove, he was finally, for the first time in his adult life, completely homeless in the best possible way. Homeless, and therefore, finally, free to find out where he actually lived. He turned and walked back toward the apartment, back toward the empty room, back toward the notebook with its 9 full spines on the shelf and the 10th waiting open on the low table. Something was coming. He could feel it in the quality of the air, in the way the city felt different around him, lighter and more present than it had that morning. Something was coming, and it was not going to look like anything that had come before. He quickened his pace without quite deciding to. The bridge was behind him now, the water was behind him, and whatever was waiting for him in that empty room was not going to wait much longer. When Elias walked back into the empty room that afternoon, he picked up a pen and drew a circle. Not intentionally, not as an experiment or a therapeutic exercise, or any of the things a trained psychologist might prescribe to a person in the middle of what looked from the outside like a prolonged breakdown. He picked up the pen because his hand wanted to move, and the hand drew a circle, and then inside the circle it drew another, and then another, and then the circles began to divide themselves into segments, and the segments began to fill with shapes that Elias did not consciously choose, lines and angles and small repeating forms that arranged themselves with a logic he could feel but not explain. He drew for 3 hours without stopping. When he finally set the pen down and looked at what was on the page, he felt the hair on the back of his neck rise slowly, the way it does when something hits a frequency your body recognizes before your mind catches up. Because the drawing was not random. It was not the product of a stressed mind generating noise. It was structured, deeply and consistently structured, and the structure was not one he had invented. He had seen versions of it before, in ancient manuscripts, in the geometric art of traditions that had no contact with each other, in diagrams from medieval alchemical texts, and in the architectural plans of sacred buildings constructed thousands of years apart on different continents. He had seen it and noted it academically, the way you note a recurring motif in literature, with interest but without urgency. Now it was coming out of his own hand unbidden, and it was not a motif, it was a map of exactly where he had been and exactly what the journey through it meant. Elias turned the drawing over and started a new one on the back. Then he took a fresh sheet of paper, then another. He drew until the light from the courtyard window faded and the room was dark except for the small lamp he had eventually reached over and switched on without interrupting the movement of his hand. The drawings accumulated around him on the floor of the empty room, concentric and recursive, and alive in a way that his published research, for all its precision, had never quite managed to be. At some point he stopped thinking about what he was drawing and simply drew. And in that space between intention and execution, something arrived that had no name but that filled the room with a quality of presence he recognized from the sessions with Casimir. Not Casimir himself, something larger than Casimir, something that Casimir had perhaps been a doorway toward all along. He worked through the night. By morning there were 43 drawings spread across the floor of the empty room, each one connected to the others in a way that was not immediately visible, but that Elias could feel as clearly as a physical thread running between them. He stood in the doorway and looked at them arranged on the floor, and felt something he had not felt in years, possibly ever. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more total than either of those. A sense of rightness, of having arrived at a place that had been waiting for him with complete patience for his entire life. He began to understand what had been happening, not just in the sessions and not just in the drawings, but across the whole arc of everything since the night he had sat at his desk and failed to recognize his own hands. The visions, the loss of his position, the descent into the silence, Casimir and the other figures, the mirror and its ledger, the walk across the bridge, and now this. All of it was not a series of separate events that had happened to him. It was a single, continuous process that had been running underneath the surface of his life long before the first vision arrived in his kitchen, waiting for the moment when the outer structure became thin enough for the inner one to show through. He had not fallen apart. He had been excavated. Something had been removing layer after layer of everything that was not essentially him until what remained was this. A man sitting on the floor of an empty room, surrounded by drawings that had come from somewhere deeper than his education, deeper than his training, deeper than the entire carefully constructed identity of Dr. Elias Vorne, neuroscientist, rational man, unmovable object. What remained was just Elias. And Elias, it turned out, was someone he had never properly met. Over the following weeks, the drawings continued. They changed in character as they accumulated, becoming less geometric and more narrative, beginning to incorporate written passages that arrived alongside the images, sentences and fragments, and sometimes full paragraphs that came with the same quality as the drawings, not thought up but received, in the way that you receive warmth from a fire or cold from an open window, passively, through simple proximity to something that was already there. Elias wrote everything down with the same compulsive care he had brought to the notebooks of the sessions, but the tone was different now. The notebooks had been records of a dialogue. These were something else. They were, he realized slowly, a document of a transformation. Not a manual, not a theory, a testimony. The account of a specific interior journey written by the person who had taken it, for no audience, with no publication in mind, with no concern for whether it would be understood or accepted or verified. Just the truth of what had happened, set down in the most accurate language available to him, which turned out to be a language made equally of words and images and structures that did not belong to any single tradition, but that borrowed freely and without apology from all of them. He began to assemble the pages into a single volume. Not immediately. It took months of sitting with the accumulated material, understanding its internal order, finding the sequence that was already present in the drawings and the written passages if you looked at them as a whole rather than as individual pieces. The volume that emerged was not large, but it was dense in the way that certain objects are dense: a stone, a seed, a word spoken at exactly the right moment, carrying far more than its surface suggested. Elias bound it himself, by hand, with materials he found in a craft shop near his apartment. Dark cloth cover, heavy cream paper, his own handwriting throughout, the drawings and the text interwoven on each page. When it was finished, he held it in both hands for a long time without opening it. It was warm in a way that surprised him, as if it had its own temperature, as if it was, in some sense he could not rationalize, alive. He placed it on the shelf in the empty room, between the row of session notebooks and the wall. Then he stood back and looked at it, and something in him knew, with quiet and absolute certainty, that this book was not finished with him yet, and that the question of what to do with it was about to become the most important question of what remained of his life. Elias never told anyone about the book while he was alive, not a single person, not a colleague, not a former student, not the one friend from his university years who still called occasionally and asked careful questions about how he was doing. The book sat on the shelf in the empty room, between the row of session notebooks and the wall, and Elias lived alongside it for years the way you live alongside something that is both completely yours and completely beyond you. He continued the sessions. He continued drawing. He continued filling notebooks with the precision and honesty that had become, after everything, the only mode of operation he had left. He wrote papers occasionally, smaller ones, published in journals that operated at the edges of mainstream academia, read by a narrow audience of people who were asking the same questions he had once dismissed. He lived quietly. He walked. He tended the plant on the kitchen windowsill with considerably more attention than he had before. And the book stayed on the shelf, dark cloth cover, heavy pages, warm to the touch, waiting with the same patience that the inner world had always shown him. He died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, in the apartment he had lived in for over 2 decades, in the room that had once been used for storage and had become the most important room in his life. His daughter found him there. Her name was Mara. She was 34 years old, a clinical psychologist with a sharp mind and a healthy skepticism about anything that could not be demonstrated empirically, a profile that will sound familiar by now. She had inherited her father's precision without, she believed, his late-life strangeness. She had watched from a careful distance as his career collapsed and his habits changed and his conversation became increasingly difficult to follow. She had loved him in the way that children love parents who are hard to reach, persistently, from a slight angle, hoping for a version of closeness that never quite arrived. When she walked into the empty room that Tuesday morning and found him gone, she stood for a long time in the doorway without moving. The room smelled like old paper and something she could not name. The light through the courtyard window was the same thin spring light it had always been. And on the shelf, between a row of dark notebooks in the wall, there was a book she had never seen before. She did not open it that day. She handled the practical matters the way she handled everything, methodically, one step at a time, with her feelings filed carefully in a place she intended to return to later. She took the notebooks, she took the book. She brought them back to her own apartment across the city and set them on her desk and looked at them for several days without touching them. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She was actually waiting for enough courage. Because something about that book, even through the dark cloth cover, even sitting inert on her desk in her ordered professional apartment, had a quality she recognized and did not want to name. It felt like an arrival, like something that had been traveling toward her for a very long time and had finally found the correct address. She opened it on a Saturday evening, alone, with a glass of water on the desk beside her and the city quiet outside her window. She opened it to the first page. She read the first paragraph, and then she sat very still for a long time without turning the page. The way you sit still when something has just rearranged the furniture of your interior world, and you need a moment before you trust yourself to stand up. Because what her father had written on that first page was not the confused testament of a man who had lost his professional footing. It was one of the most precise and honest and structurally coherent accounts of the inner life she had ever encountered. And she had read widely. It made her published dissertation look like a rough sketch. Not because her work was poor, because this was operating from a depth she had not previously known existed in her own field. She read through the night. She turned pages carefully, stopping at the drawings, tracing the lines with her fingertip without quite touching the surface, feeling the weight and intention in each one. By morning she had read half the book and taken 12 pages of notes in her own notebook, the professional one she kept for case reflections. But these notes were different from her usual entries. They were less clinical and more personal, less observed and more inhabited, as if the act of reading her father's account was doing something to the membrane between her professional self and whatever lived underneath it, making it thinner, more permeable, more honest. She finished the book 2 days later. She closed it and held it in both hands the same way Elias had held it when he bound it, feeling its specific warmth, its particular density. And she understood two things simultaneously. The first was that her father had not lost his mind. He had found something that most minds never locate because they are too busy being impressive to be open. The second was that she was now holding a map, a real one. Not metaphorical, not poetic, not the kind of thing you appreciate academically and then set back on the shelf. A functional map of a territory that she, despite her training and her expertise and her careful management of her own interior life, had never fully entered. And the map was asking her, without words, with nothing but its warmth in her hands and the weight of its pages and the memory of every drawing she had spent the night tracing with her fingertip, it was asking her whether she intended to use it. She placed the book on her own shelf. She cleared the spare room of her apartment. She put a cushion in the center of the floor. She sat down. She opened a fresh notebook. And she waited, with the particular quality of attention her father had spent years learning to cultivate, for whatever was going to arrive. The silence in the room was not empty. It never is, once you know how to listen. It was full, dense with presence, humming at a frequency just below the range of ordinary hearing. She sat in it and breathed and held the pen and did not try to control what was coming. She simply made herself available, the way her father had once described in the book, the way you leave a door open for someone whose name you do not yet know, but whose arrival you have somehow always been expecting. The tradition was passing, not through institutions, not through publications or conferences, or the careful machinery of academic inheritance. Through a room, a cushion, a notebook, and the willingness of one person to stop performing certainty long enough to encounter something real. Here is what I take from all of it. The outer world rewards the performance. It gives you the title, the recognition, the decorated career, the well-dressed life. But none of that reaches the place in you that actually needs to be reached. The only thing that reaches that place is the willingness to stop, to sit in the silence, to look at the mirror without managing what you see in it, to let the old version of yourself become genuinely unnecessary before you demand to know what comes next. Elias did not become whole by acquiring more. He became whole by allowing everything false to leave. And what remained when it did was not emptiness. It was the most solid thing he had ever stood on. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. What is the one thing about yourself that you have never been willing to look at directly? The thing you have been managing and framing and carefully keeping just outside your own line of sight? And what do you think you would find if you finally stopped looking away? Write it in the comments. Not for me, for yourself. Because the answer is the beginning of the only journey that actually matters. If this story moves something in you, leave a like and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and there is more to come.